right. All right. Hello, everyone. All right, this is QCC Live, Gay City's monthly queer community conversations. And this is really our opportunity to lift up the work of BIPOC-led serving organizations and the work they're doing to improve health equity in our community. And first thing we want to do to start up is by talking about our sponsor, Pacific Medical Centers, a multi-specialty medical group with 9 neighborhood clinics in the Puget Sound area. Since 1933, the PacMed network has grown to offer patients more than 150 providers of primary and specialty care, unified through the region. From transgender care to openly LGBTQIA providers, PacMed teams are here to work together to support your best health for your life and journey. You can learn more about PacMed at pacificmedicalcenters.org. Again, that is pacificmedicalcenters.org. My name is Melvin Givens, and I use he, him pronouns, and I am today's host. Today, we're discussing how to support folks and create take a liberatory approach to mental health. Participation in social movements as a solution towards our collective well-being. Before we start the conversation today, we need to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present, and honor the gratitude, the land itself, and the Duwamish tribe. If you live or have lived in Seattle, please visit realrentduwamish.org and pay rent directly to the first peoples of this land. To learn more about the lands of the first people across the state, please visit gaycity.org/native lands. Again, gaycity.org/native-lands. Before we get started, though, there's a couple housekeeping items that we want to share. Today's Zoom will be recorded for the guests, and it will only feature the faces of our panelists and can be watched again on Gay City's Facebook page. Throughout the next hour, we encourage you to ask any questions you may have for our guests or even technical questions in the Q&A in the toolbar below. If you have questions or resources to share, please use the chat box, which is also located in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. We want to set some community guidelines to ensure this webinar provides a comfortable space for our community to engage, even in the chat box. Please make space for others to speak, leave room for the uncomfortable, practice humility, acknowledge intent versus impact, and talk from your experiences using I statements. So let's get started. Today, I'm joined by Donna Danina of Gabrielle Seattle and International Women's Alliance, and Nadine Guyo from National Alliance for Filipino Concerns and the Filipino Community Health Board. Yeah, welcome, friends. If you could feel free to introduce yourselves with your name, pronouns, and title, and yeah.
Okay, I'll go. Hi, thanks everyone. Thanks Melvin for the introduction. Again, I'm Donna Danina. I go by she, her pronouns. And I am with a group called Gabriella Seattle. We're a progressive Filipino women's organization. We were founded in 2003. So I've been doing this work for about 18 years now. Our movement is connected to the national liberation struggle in my homeland, the Philippines. And just a little bit about our group. We are a collective of Filipinas celebrating our multifaceted identities, revolutionary history, and rich culture. And we work to build a community in the Seattle area, investing in educating, defending, and advocating for the human rights of Filipinas globally. I've also taken the work to the international level with the International Women's Alliance, which is a grassroots global alliance of different women's organizations and institutions, including individuals nationwide and internationally, with an anti-imperialist perspective, trying to build a progressive women's movement in the 21st century. So I'll go ahead and pass it to my co-presenter, Nadine.
Hi, my name is Nadine Guyo. I go by she, her pronouns. I'm an organizer with the National Alliance of Filipino Concerns. I'm with the Washington Regional Chapter. NAFCON for short, we serve the interests and concerns of the Filipino people, both here in the United States and also in the Philippines. We want to advocate for the rights and welfare of Filipinos through our action-oriented platform. We're really guided by 4 pillars in our work of culture and heritage, education, health and wellness, and advocacy. This past year, a lot of our work has focused on health and wellness as an initiative here in Seattle to respond to the needs of Filipinos during this ongoing pandemic. And through that initiative, we are building a project called the Filipino Community Health Board to really hone in on what are the health needs of Filipinos locally. So that's a little bit of the organizing work that I've done. I think I've been community organizing in Seattle since my undergrad, so about 6 or 7 years now. I'm also a graduate student at Seattle University in the nurse practitioner program with a focus on psychiatric mental health. Just to plug that neither Donna and I are mental health professionals, but we do have a lot of experience in navigating mental health in our communities and also in our personal lives as well. So that's kind of the way we're approaching this Q&A today. I also worked in an outpatient behavioral health center for 3 years, working with houseless folks and folks who have substance use disorder as well.
Oh, great. Yeah. And I think that kind of leads into the first question is, you've described your work, but also curious, one of the first questions we usually we like to ask is, how has your identity and life experiences led you to get into this work?
I can share a little bit. So I am a daughter of an immigrant from the Philippines. And I think that greatly impacted the way that I navigate life and also traumas that came with it, I think it wasn't until community organizing and even getting an orientation on Gabriella Seattle, where I think that's where I really connected mental health to the social conditions of society and how mental health challenges are often perpetuated by the social economic system that we live in. So being that my mom, I think just growing up in Seattle, there wasn't really a dedicated space to talk about mental health issues that BIPOC folks often experience, and especially children who came from migrants as well. So I really got into the work kind of like at my own peak in my mental health journey of trying to understand why I grew up the way that I did, why I witnessed the things that I did. And I think, for full transparency, as like a survivor of child sexual abuse and also just a lot of trauma in the household, I really felt lost and didn't really know, didn't have a collective to really lean on to help understand how my childhood impacts the way that I show up as an adult, why I had certain triggers, why I was struggling in different relationships. And I think because of that, and also because of like professional help as well, it really drew me into finding a collective, a group of people who really were asking the same questions that I did, of like, why did I grow up this way? And what were the conditions of my parents? Like, what did they have to go through to make, to like behave in a way that they are? So I think it's hard to find communities who can answer that. But I think through social movements and understanding that, I think through community organizing, that's when I really learned that my mom is a product of forced migration and the semi-colonial and semi-feudal system in the Philippines of, essentially like not having a lot of opportunities back in the Philippines and having to immigrate to the US as someone who was undocumented and like had to, enter in a marriage in order to, gain citizenship, which is, I think, a common issue that a lot of migrant women, not just Filipinos, have to face. And I think through her life experiences, a lot of that trauma in itself of having to assimilate, it impacts the household. So instead of, I think, growing up with a lot of resentment, I think community organizing and understanding the problems of my homeland, my mom's homeland, I really gained a more objective understanding of the different attitudes and culture of Filipinos here in the US and why mental health really is a struggle among Filipinos and Filipino Americans, So I think it was through my own mental health struggle and like finding healing through community organizing was really what projected me into the field, into the organizing sphere that I'm in now. And because, because I personally know what it's like to have, negative individual thoughts, I think it drives me more to not want any other person to have to experience that. And I think because of that, that's why it's so important to also organize, to also pair your own personal journey to answering the problems that are perpetuating mental health struggles in the first place. So that is a little bit about me, a lot of bit about me. Donna, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, I think I have very similar experiences with Nadine, with the, forced migration of my family similarly. But I also was an immigrant. I actually immigrated here from the Philippines with my mother to join my father, be reunited with him, who came to the US by way of the US military. That was sort of the way the United States would encourage and also use as a tool of colonialism to try to ensure that the Philippine government would remain subservient to like the needs and interests of the United States. And so my dad, as a pathway to citizenship, enlisted, joined the US military, and then my mother and I later joined her. So just kind of growing up in that sort of like immigrant life. My parents were young, trying to parent 4 children in a new country and trying to navigate the system came with a lot of challenges. On top of my dad sort of like being ingrained in like the US military industrial complex and like the very strong misogynistic patriarchal culture that it breeds, he definitely brought that into the home. And the patriarchal culture, the feudal culture is already very strong in Philippine society. So that coupled with, what he sees and how he's practiced his own patriarchal tendencies just by, like having a lot of different mistresses and not being the best husband, and that having an impact on my mom and kind of seeing her navigate that as a survivor. I'm also a survivor of child sexual abuse. And so all of those things, I think, compounded my own mental health struggles. I also, I don't want to say it was a privilege, but we did have an opportunity to live overseas because of my dad being in the military. And so I actually went to high school in the Middle East. And it was there that I actually witnessed kind of more systematically the forced migration, specifically of Filipino women working overseas, leaving their families and children behind, working as domestic workers in a country that could afford, right? That kind of those types of like services in the home. So domestic labor is very, very cheap in countries that are rich because of the oil. So in countries in the Middle East, domestic workers coming from the Philippines and other underdeveloped countries is very common. And so witnessing that the treatment of women, which their working conditions were horrible. I was a young teenager at the time, trying to understand the world and still trying to understand my own identity as a Filipino living in a country that I couldn't fully claim as my own, right? And at the same time, totally disconnected from my homeland and lost touch with my own native language, where I sort of had to relearn that. So I think there are a lot of things, being an immigrant, having to deal with like instability of home life and also like experiences of trauma compounding the different mental health struggles. And so as an adult, the way that I coped with it, because I didn't have a full understanding of what it all meant, or like could only really listen to my body, and how my body would react to certain things, because that's sort of how mental health manifests itself, is just through bodily reactions, emotions that sometimes you can't articulate. And I did engage in very unhealthy coping mechanisms, did indulge in a little bit of like substance abuse and substance use as a way to kind of numb the feelings or to not want to confront what was happening inside. And so I think my narrative is not any different from many folks out there. And then on top of that, I do identify as queer, and I came out later in my adult life. Um, with children, right? So I was married at one point and kind of went through this long journey of trying to find myself and my identity as a queer Filipina immigrant woman living in this country. And it wasn't until I really embedded myself in community organizing to kind of help piece the puzzles together for me, understanding my history, my people's history, understanding the reasons why so many of our people migrate, which then gave me an ability to extend empathy towards my parents, who I felt like were not the best, right? But they were doing their best in terms of trying to raise their family and their children. And I think that coming full circle for me, and really wanting to empower others and the community, to understand your family history, understand social conditions, because it does help you navigate and understand better yourself and how to navigate the mental health struggles that you yourself experience, and then to connect with others who will understand you. I think that is that's been the most powerful tool for me in kind of navigating sometimes what we see compartmentalized, right? Like social conditions, problems of society, and then our own mental health struggles that we seem to like take on as individuals. And what we're saying is we want to pull people out of that isolation so that we can create a society where folks don't have to experience these really hard and hurtful emotions that keep us in the dark. And part of community organizing and social movements is to change the conditions so people can actually live fulfilling lives, right? Which overall will then like improve our mental well-being. So that's a little bit about my personal story too.
Yes, thank you. Thank you both. Really appreciate that. And it just seems like community organizing has kind of been a healing space for both of you, and being able to, and also, tangentially, your family and community. So, and I kind of feel like that is something, a similar thing that we've kind of heard from other community organizers that we've spoken with on QCC. And is probably a very key thing to mental health. So, it kind of makes me wonder, about mental health and why it's so important to community and community organizers, especially as we're, right now we're navigating a pandemic that we did not even foresee, a couple years ago. Yeah, if you could share a little bit about that.
Yeah, I can start. I think across the board, the pandemic really exposed and exacerbated what has already been there, right? In terms of um, the social inequities in society that have been existing today were just further perpetuated under the pandemic. For example, the fact that um, majority of people who are working were all of a sudden out of income, but there was already that sort of social inequity of those who have more and those who have less. And uh, the majority of people who have less or not enough resources to really survive were really impacted. And then I think with the instance of just, the patterns of violence against women, they've always been there, but further exacerbated under the pandemic because now they're sort of forced under lockdown to be in close proximity many times with their perpetrator. And so I think a lot of these social issues, I think, really came to the forefront now that we have a system that sort of failed to have a response comprehensively, right, to address people's needs. And we definitely saw that here in this country, the rise in unemployment, and the lack of support for those who were forced to really be on the front lines, right? Health workers, folks who are working in grocery stores, or just like businesses that were considered essential. We just weren't prepared. We didn't see it coming. And I think living in a country that's supposed to brand itself as the most advanced, right? Or the most prepared or has the most resources still failed in responding to the needs of the majority of people. But I'll go ahead and pass it on to Nadine if I'm sure she has other thoughts with that as well.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing, Donna, because I think what you said around, you know, the pandemic only exposed what was currently there. And I think if we specifically examine the mental health system, the mental health system, its paradigm is based off of like a biomedical framework of, just diagnose the person, just diagnose the individual. And it frequently dismisses the interrelations of mental health and society. And if we just view mental health as like a biological phenomena, and it's only like a sole responsible issue of the individual, it really just fails to address the root causes of why people are getting sick in the first place. So while it isn't surprising, it still, sucks that it really exacerbated the mental health. Like I think a lot of people during this time really needed mental health um, professionals and support because everyone was navigating a very isolated time. And I think it only goes to show that it hasn't, in a time of great need and crisis, the mental health system still failed. And a part of that, right, is I think when we talked about this in the staff meeting, we talked about what kind of culture that we're living in. The culture that we're living in is where people are feeling the pressure to succeed, the pressure to produce more. There's a concentration of wealth in the US that's being held by only a small minority of people, the top 1%, whereas the rest of us, everyone else is left on their own. We're seeing a crisis in housing, increase in food security. There are so many social issues that need to be addressed, and these systems that are supposed to work, but because of the culture of capitalism that we're living in, it makes sense why it's failing, because the system is only focusing on creating more profit over actually serving people. And because of that, I think that's why the mental health system right now, because it isn't genuinely serving people without any interests, it actually enforces the violence of like not trying to solve um, problems, issues that people are experiencing, but it's almost as if like unintentionally or not, people are still going to get sick. And it's not really resolving anything. It's just creating a very vicious cycle of people still enduring mental health issues during this very difficult time when, you know, supposedly the system is supposed to help us.
Mhm. And I think when you think about even those who, got sick from COVID and thinking about the conditions that led them to become vulnerable to the virus, these were people who had existing, health problems to begin with, which were contributed by poor diet, right? Contributed by stress, and contributed by other external conditions that led to their failing health condition in the first place, right? And most of these people are those who are on the lower tier of the socioeconomic class status, right? Those who are living below the poverty line or just struggling to make ends meet. Those who are working in really hard, laborious jobs. Those who experience on the daily discrimination and racism because of the kind of culture we live in. So these are the people who are being the most affected, right? And so the numbers are real, and I think the pandemic has really shown us that it's the most vulnerable, those that are living under the harshest conditions that are being taken, their lives are being taken away, right? The most vulnerable, the elderly, who really need a lot of care and attention. And so I think these are some things as a society we need to study and be aware of. And these are also things we can change, right? These are conditions created by society. So the only solution is a social solution that can benefit everyone. And I think had we approached the pandemic with a social response, we could have saved many, many more lives. So just something to add to in terms of the pandemic.
Yes, thank you, thank you. And I appreciate, I love that you're talking about social ways of addressing it. Are there any strategies or any other things that we'd love to dive a little bit deeper and just kind of learn what are some of those strategies and ways that we could be doing more of that work.
Yeah, I think something that I've been learning throughout this pandemic and trying to understand the needs of Filipinos and mental health is like mental health isn't going to be something that they talk about like the first time that they meet you. They'll often talk about what are the physiological manifestations of mental health that need to be for them, like need to be addressed first. So I think the beautiful part about community organizing that I think a lot of that the medical model kind of fails to do is actually create genuine relationships through community organizing, through on the ground grassroots organizing. So I think like a strategy that we've done is actually trying to immerse ourselves in community during a time where the call is to actually do the opposite. During this pandemic, the call is to isolate. And I think still while trying to navigate and respecting safety practices like social distancing, we still tried, like as community organizers and specifically in NAFCON, we still tried to make it a point to reach out to community during this really hard time. So I think some examples that we've done is one, like actually be on the ground to understand what are the needs of people right now. And oftentimes it looks like having conversations, obviously with your community members. It's really like, that's kind of like, it seems like this simple first step of actually talking to people and asking them what they need. Um, and in order to build that trust, there's a need to also do like follow up and be consistent about collectively trying to problem solve. How can we address those needs? So, for example, one of our community partners, the International Drive-In Center, they serve like hundreds of Filipino elders, and something that they needed was meal deliveries. A lot of their elders use the community center to access food, and because of the social distancing, they weren't able to go out of their homes, and they're a particularly vulnerable demographic of people, like elderly. So we were able to mobilize volunteers through NAFCON to help bring meal deliveries to the Filipino elders. And then on top of that, try and do follow-up calls to elders to do check-ins and see how they're doing. And so, yeah, I guess a strategy or an aspect of a strategy is really doing that genuine trust building and relationship building with community members, not only to just investigate what they're going through, but actually be action oriented in solving the current problem that they're facing at that time. That's a little bit of work that NAFCON does, but Donna, if you want to talk a little bit more about any campaigns that you all are doing.
Yeah, I guess like before I get into the campaigns, I did want to like elaborate on the trust building, because it did come up in our staff conversation, where we live in a society where trust is constantly broken between individuals and between communities, right? Where you don't have like queer and trans folks trusting straight folks. You don't trust like POC communities don't trust like white communities. Civil society has no trust in our government, right? Like we don't have trust in corporations. I mean, we're just like constantly living in a world where trust is broken. And so kind of going back to basics of human relationships and trust building is like the foundational thing of being able to work together with people, right? As human beings, we're naturally built to be social beings. And the only way to do that and to build connection is to build trust. So I can't emphasize enough how important it is to do that, which is kind of number one and key in addressing mental health, is like working with people that you have trust in. And then kind of then thinking through, knowing that a lot of issues that we're faced with that affect our mental health are social issues. We have to look at the root causes, right? Really understand and get at the root causes of why there are so many social inequities that create that level of distrust between people and communities. So one way to do that, one way to like really address those social inequities is through like carrying out political fights or carrying out different campaigns, waging different types of struggles collectively with people to actually move towards some kind of social change. And I think once you place your individual problems in the context of a bigger system, in some way it helps to lighten the load or the burden of what you're going through, because you see your struggles and challenges in the context of like a bigger system that we're trying to fight and a bigger solution that we're striving for. So some of the campaigns right now that's really specific to the work that I'm doing as a member of Gabriella is we're really trying to liberate our homeland. I mean, that's a major thing and a huge sort of like objective to meet, but we really see the relationship between how our homeland has been impacted by colonialism and imperialism. And until we cut those ties, right, until we're able to really liberate and free our homeland, then we can address all the other social problems that are happening within our country. But right now, we're so tied to the interests of the corporate and multinational corporations that have a vested interest in our land. So our people aren't able to really develop industry to have jobs, which is why so many of them are having to move overseas, right? So kind of seeing those linkages together helps us better understand the solution. If you understand the problem, you have a better understanding of what are the correct solutions. So going back to the thing of like understanding the root causes, then helps you better strategize an approach to coming up with different types of solutions for the purpose of bettering, right? Bettering the situation, alleviating the impacts in some way. But at the end of the day, there is a structure that's perpetuating all of this, right? This structure, this system that we talk about sometimes ambiguously, really is the system of capitalism. We really have to examine how capitalism has created conditions for people everywhere around the world to live under such harsh, inhumane conditions. And so if we can make that tie and make that link, I think, and work collectively together based on our interests, based on our capacity, I have a lot of hope that we can create a better world for everyone.
Yes, I appreciate that. Yeah. And especially as the holidays are starting to approach, I think this is very much a crucial conversation to have as well. And I'm curious to know if you've kind of seen that also in the work around the holidays being a key time to really elevate these conversations and to do this work. And yeah, and how has it impacted the commitment to people bettering their mental health behaviors as well?
I think the first thing is to just be practical too. Like holidays are not always happy times for everyone. And I think just being pragmatic with how to navigate the holiday season, especially with those who do have pretty, severe symptoms of mental health, where holidays can actually exacerbate their situation. So just some practical things to keep in mind. This is not even going into like community organizing or anything, but just some like basic tips of like, if you don't feel safe, being around people, like to limit your exposure to others, or if you really do need to be around people, maybe considering outdoors. I know in the Pacific Northwest right now, that's not the most conducive option, but really trying to figure out ways to still practice social distance while at the same time being able to get that level of social connection that so many people need, especially during the time of the holidays. And, ensuring like good hygiene, face coverings, sanitation, maybe shortening the length of the gathering just to minimize like further exposure that could, create conditions for someone to get sick. I think those are just some practical things to consider. But knowing that, this is a time when people do gather, I think these are just some reminders for folks to keep in mind. But holidays are also a good way to really bring people together as community organizers, right? It's a good way to be celebratory, right? And to not always think about how hard the work can be as community organizers, but to also celebrate the little victories, right? By being amongst community, being with people, sharing food, sharing resources. I think these are ways that we can also maximize the holiday season. So just some things off top, but I'm sure Nadine also has some other suggestions to consider too.
Yeah, I think like just the things around being around community like during a pandemic, it's really hard. But I think what comes up for me personally, like around the holidays, is family. And I think the way holidays are marketed it's very like family, like positive experiences of family, which I think like is totally real, and an absolute like valid part of the holidays is being with family. And at the same time, it can also be a very hard time for folks to navigate, knowing that's kind of how the current culture really propagates the holidays. It's like togetherness with a family, but maybe just taking even a step back, if you do have really complex family dynamics, is to also consider what are other ways to build community that's not necessarily in the way that society really uplifts or popularizes. Sometimes family for me means my people that I organize with, the collectives who have seen me at my worst, but also seen me at my best. And sometimes that's not always, I think it's just offering space for complexities around the holidays, especially with family, I think is really important for me. And I think if you are with family, just being able to do, I think what's also helpful, maybe like a tip, is studying what your boundaries are if you are going to be with family. Like what are your limitations, like what is okay for you to be around, and like what are some indicators to you that you're not doing well around family. And then after being able to identify your boundaries, what are some ways to then cope when you are triggered, or like when you are struggling in a certain space during the holidays? What can you do to cope with those things? I think doing this with other people, with your friends, or your fellow, I don't know if you're in like a community organizing space, to do it with other folks. I think it's just a helpful way to actually have some foresight of what you could be experiencing during the holidays.
Thank you. And I just want to take a second. I know that we have some community that's in this, because we're in a couple different spaces with this stream. So I also want to just encourage our friends that are in Zoom and online. Please feel free to ask questions on the platform that you're in. We're definitely monitoring both. So yeah, feel free to add those in there, and we'll definitely share those with our great panelists, our great guests here. Yeah, well, let's see. One question that I did have is, how can organizations, like Gay City, how can we do that work of lifting up the adoption of better mental health practices? What are some of those things that we can do as an agency?
Yeah, and this is such like a multifaceted question, because there's a lot that organizations can totally do, and I think it just really depends on like what are your objectives and vision as an org. I think what comes up for me are two things. One is, studying like what are liberatory approaches to health, because when we talk about mental health, it's not separate from health as a whole. So I think approaching mental health from like a holistic standpoint is really helpful. And I think secondly, one of the models that we talked about is a liberation health model, where it's a way to understand that human behavior can be conceptualized as the personal, cultural, and institutional. Personal being like where you were born, your position in your family, your individual emotional conditions, and then the other two factors of culture, like gender, race, class, position. And the institutional one, like what are the institutional systems that really help us understand what are the root causes of health issues. So when we talk about institutional systems, I think the primary one that we talk about with an anti-capitalist lens is is class, like how we're currently living in a capitalist class system, which and there are so many institutions that are dominant in our lives and dictate how we heal or not heal. So I think just having a comprehensive view of health in itself through the lens of liberation and like addressing the social causes as well, to help, you know, everyone deserves to live a full and healthy life. So how can we better do that? Not only address the individual needs, but address it collectively. So I think the aspect of the liberation health model is also putting things into action. And oftentimes that means engaging in what Donna was saying, like waging in political fights, political campaigns to actually address the root causes of why people are sick. So I think maybe like an example of this is right now our organizations have been focusing on passing the Philippine Human Rights Act. In the US, half of our US budget is dedicated towards the military, while social services like health, education, housing, they only get like 7% of the budget. So I think a concrete step that we're trying to achieve is passing the Philippine Human Rights Act to redirect tax dollars instead of perpetuating you know, militarization of other foreign countries like the Philippines, to actually address the root problems that are happening here in our backyard and redirect those our tax dollars and funding towards social services that can actually address people's problems that are the root cause of mental health issues in the first place. So I think, yeah, that's another piece. And also just like this space, I think Gay City connecting with community organizations and learning, doing like mutual learning is really helpful to exchange ideas and how we can best serve community. I think that's the ultimate objective of why we're here, is like, how can we best serve? So I think orgs connecting with other orgs is, you know, a part of the answer to this. Or Donna, I think you can share more too.
I guess maybe the only other thing to add to like in considering how different organizations can change their approaches is what, you know, Nadine pointed to, is really combining the service approach or service provisions with community organizing, or just understanding what the social issues are by doing partnerships like this, right? Those who are really like at the grassroots. And I think many organizations can also benefit from not just creating spaces for folks to really like normalize talking about mental health, like whether it's incorporating it into different support groups or even among coworkers in a workplace, like really making that a normal practice, so that we don't create this culture of like mental health is a taboo thing, but it's actually part of our everyday lives, that having good mental health is what we're striving for. So let's just make it a everyday practice and normalize talking about what we're struggling with. And I think it just helps create an environment of, again, trust building, right? But combining that sort of practice with also educating ourselves on the social issues. So doing education, political education, inviting different groups that may have more experience in one particular subject or topic that has an impact to particular communities, and learning from each other. So that combination of like making space for talking about our personal issues and struggles, and then putting that in the context of like, what are the different social issues that are happening politically in our communities or around the world, so that we can see the interconnectedness of the external sort of like happenings of what's going on in the world with also how we're feeling impacted internally. So I think that that combination would serve as a way to really approach mental health in a more, I think, holistic way, towards the direction of really like creating social change.
Great. Thank you. And it looks like we have a question from the audience here. And so one of those the question is, are there any books or resources that you would recommend to learn more on this topic to sharpen our collective analysis?
Thanks for asking that question. It's really great because there are some books out there that can help sharpen this analysis. And I think I can name a couple of books. One is called A New Outlook on Health, which I think is, it's a very current book. Like it talks about the pandemic and our failing health system as well. And like what are with like a anti-capitalist perspective. So I would recommend that book, A New Outlook on Health, that you can get on foreign language press. Another book I'd recommend is called Toward Psychologies of Liberation. And that book also helps outline the liberation health model too, and how community organizations can adopt this view. Those are the top two I can think of in my head. Are there any other ones that you'd recommend, Donna?
Maybe just naming some local, like institutional resources, like organizations that also have different forms of liberatory models, like API Chaya, I would say, adopts some of these practices where they do sort of the combination of service provision and community organizing. And then all the different grassroots organizations that are already sort of doing this kind of work in practice to differing degrees. So the different organizations that we are a part of, NAFCON, Gabriella, and there are a number of others too that are specific. These are specific for those in the Filipino community, but for non-Filipinos, there are other types of organizations like the International League of People Struggle, which carries a whole number of different issues and concerns where they're really trying to get at the root causes of things. And there is a local ILPS group here. And then, you know, for youth and students in particular, for those of you that are Filipino looking into Anak Bayan, that's one that's, you know, directly connected to our homeland in the Philippines. And there are several chapters that are based here in the Seattle area. So those are just a few to name some that are local.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. And you know, I know looking at the time, I know that we're close to the end of our session. So I definitely wanted to leave space for folks to learn how they can connect with you, how they how they can connect with your organizations and learn more.
Yeah, I can put my email and maybe Nadine too in the chat box if folks want to just hit us up directly. But you can also find our organizational handles on Instagram. So for Gabriella Seattle, just literally look us up. Same for NAFCON, I believe it's under NAFCON Washington. And then IWA Seattle, the International Women's Alliance, we're also on Instagram. We're also on Facebook too. So I think just, you know, give us a shout and we'll do our best to get back to you.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you both for just carving out time out of your schedules and to come and speak with us today. To our audience, we will follow up via email with a brief evaluation survey and any resources mentioned in the session. And please remember that Gay City is still offering services such as HIV, STI testing. We have a PrEP clinic, healthcare navigation, and resources and referrals. So if you're seeking support in any of those areas, please give us a call, 206-323-LGBT, or visit gaycity.org. And I should also note, you know, as we're talking about mental health, finances can definitely play an impact on that. And so if COVID-19 has impacted you financially, please connect with our resource center today. You may be eligible to receive up to $3,000 depending on your family size as support during this time. We are currently supporting and elevating the conversation around the Seattle Relief Fund. And so everything closes on November 15th. That's this coming Monday. So please give us a call. Contact us 206-323-LGBT, or you can visit gaycity.org/relief and you can get more details about that, about the fund. Besides that, thank you all so much for joining us today. And we definitely want to thank our sponsors, PacMed. My name is Melvin Gibbons, and we'll see you all next time. Take care.